House in 2000. Freedom House in 2019 documented a decline in civil and political rights in both newly established and longstanding democratic regimes since the 2000s, characterizing this trend as democracy in retreat on the global stage. And then in 2020, Freedom House described democracy under assault. And this downward spiral has continued and intensified with autocratic leaders pursuing unchecked power, demonizing political and cultural minorities. We've seen this play out in front of us in the US, particularly on January 6th and even beyond. But this revival of authoritarian and even fascist political currents, including in some of the world's most advanced, longstanding democracies, helped to motivate the book project's focus on the linkages between labor rights and democracy. Democracy's global retreat has coincided with an erosion of organizational and political strength of labor unions in much of the world. But the relationship between these two empirical trends has yet to receive the systematic scholarly attention that we think would be helpful. So scholars have largely neglected to examine how democratic regress has been fostered or conditioned by the weakening organized labor as a political force, particularly in an era of unfettered global markets, highly concentrated wealth, and politically empowered private capital. Is democratic erosion tied to political weakening of organized labor, and is it associated with the emasculation of labor rights? What are the prospects for labor to play a constructive role in securing both political democracy and social and economic citizenship rights in the contemporary global arena? This volume addresses these questions from a range of disciplinary perspectives, and we have contributions from scholars in the fields of law, political science, history, sociology. It includes international, cross-regional comparative perspectives in order to highlight the global character of the challenges to labor rights and democracy in advanced industrial societies, but also in developing regions where democratic institutions are more recently or tenuously established. So this morning, we will explore these issues with 4 of our contributors to the volume. Each speaker will have 8 to 10 minutes to discuss their chapters, and we'll save a few minutes for comments and questions from the audience. And once again, we're delighted you were able to join us this morning. And we'll begin with Ken Roberts.
Okay, well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be part of the panel this morning and to be part of this forthcoming edited volume that you just heard described to you. I think for a number of us, we've had the sense that it's a good time to revisit some of the big questions about labor's role to democracy and the historic relationship between organized labor and political democracy in a context where, as Angela said, we see processes of democratic backsliding taking place or democratic erosion in many parts of the world, including many countries where democracy was considered to be relatively well established. And so I think it puts a lot of these questions back on the agenda for debate. And part of the purpose of this volume is to try to rethink these questions and to put them in the contemporary context. So I think this volume fills an important niche, and it's nice to be part of it. My own paper for this volume is essentially an attempt to try to identify 3 different analytical dimensions where the relationship between labor and democracy has been historically important. And so in essence, it's an effort to try to provide a bit of a theoretical framing for the volume, because I think most of the contributions to the different chapters to the volume are exploring labor and democracy along one of these 3 analytical dimensions that I try to lay out. So I'll just briefly go through those and before I turn it over to others. First, the first central analytical dimension that I look at is the role of labor historically in the construction of democratic regimes. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but basically the construction and extension of democracy itself as a political regime. A second major analytical dimension then looking at what is often called the deepening of democracy, the efforts to extend democratic principles of participation and accountability outside the narrow political sphere to the workplace or other social and economic spheres of human interaction, and also to the construction of social citizenship rights. And so we'll talk about the role of labor historically in deepening democracy to these other dimensions. And then finally, as as the contemporary period shows us quite dramatically, the question of labor's role in defending democracy. To what extent is organized labor an important actor in insulating or shielding democratic regimes from the kinds of corrosive practices and tendencies that we've seen in many different parts of the world. So those are the three analytical dimensions that I talk about in this paper: constructing democratic regimes, deepening or extending democracy to social and economic relationships, and then defending democracy itself. So let me start to say a few words about the first one, in constructing democratic regimes. There's, of course, a long literature in the social sciences that talks about the historic role of labor unions in the construction of political democracy, even though a lot of the early literature tended to associate democracy with the rise of the bourgeoisie and the middle classes. And certainly there are places where you can find the bourgeoisie and the middle classes playing an important role in the construction of democracy. But very often those are very limited democratic regimes. And it was often the historic role of the labor unions to really push limited or oligarchic democracies to become mass democracies and to extend suffrage rights in particular and other kinds of citizenship rights beyond the very narrow starting points that democracy had. And so in much of the world, you see organized labor playing a central role in extending democracy to the mass of the citizenry. And of course, in many places, you also see organized labor playing a central role in the initial construction of democratic regimes, where you see organized labor challenging autocracies and essentially linking their material or their economic claims to political citizenship rights, understanding that for labor to really advance their economic interests, that they needed the rights to assemble and to organize politically and to achieve representation in the political sphere. So this is something you see not only historically in Europe and Latin America, but you see also in more recent times, many of the newer democratic regimes in Asia and Africa, countries like South Korea, Poland in Eastern Europe, Tunisia, South Africa, in many countries where labor unions played critical roles in challenging autocratic governments, advancing both their economic claims, but also advancing political claims and the rights to organize, to assemble freely, and to achieve representation in the political sphere. So this is a key area then where we see organized labor, both historically and in contemporary times, in many different parts of the world, playing a central role in the construction of democratic regimes. Also, the second key analytical dimension I talk about in deepening democracy, especially I think in the Western liberal democratic tradition, there's an understanding of citizenship rights as pertaining strictly to the political sphere, the right to vote, the right to, the rule of law, and in having certain kinds of rights to assemble and participate in the political process. But oftentimes it's labor unions that have tried to extend those democratic norms of participation and representation and accountability from narrow political spheres to broader spheres of human interaction, including the workplace and economic firms. So a long tradition of work on industrial democracy and democracy in the workplace. Also the role of labor unions in the construction of social citizenship rights, trying to extend democratic norms of citizenship from the narrow political sphere to broader spheres where especially in some of the social democratic countries where it's widely recognized that political citizenship comes attached as well to social and economic citizenship rights, to education, to healthcare, to family support, to old age security. So a much broader range of social and economic citizenship rights that one has as a member of the polity, as a citizen. So the notion of citizenship itself is extended to these broader spheres. And labor unions and labor-based political parties, the social democratic parties in particular, have been central players in the construction of these broader understandings of citizenship that we see in different parts of the world. So there are important differences in the kinds of welfare states that get constructed and the kinds of social benefits that states provide in countries that have these broader and more elaborate understandings of citizenship that labor unions have fought for historically. And then finally, the third dimension that I talk about in the paper, something that a lot of us are thinking about in recent times, is simply the erosion of democracy, if not necessarily the erosion in some places, at least overt challenges to democratic regimes themselves by political actors who clearly are less than democratic. And in contrast to historic patterns where it was often actors outside the democratic arena, militaries or revolutionary movements of some sort, somebody who would challenge democratic regimes. What's been very pronounced in recent times are challenges to democracy from within democratic institutions themselves by political actors who are competing in elections, winning elections, taking office democratically, but then proceeding to whittle away at the democratic checks and balances that we take for granted in democratic regimes. And so this is something that we've seen in many different parts of the world. I mean, there are versions of the story that can be told, obviously, in the United States itself. But to the extent that labor unions have been important historically in constructing political democracy and creating a broader understanding of social citizenship rights, to what extent do we see labor being part of the struggle to defend democratic regimes and to prevent the kinds of democratic backsliding that we're seeing in different parts of the world? And so I think in particular, what jumps out at me is in Europe and Latin America, where you see the breakdown of historic patterns of class-based political representation, where there have been dramatic decreases in labor union density. So there have been declines in organized labor in some countries, as well as a breakdown or a weakening of labor-based political parties, or where you see historic labor-based political parties that have converged on the economic platform, sort of, the platform of market globalization or neoliberalism, where you get a programmatic convergence of mainstream political parties. And we've seen the erosion of the class-based political cleavages that structured political representation in many different countries historically. And I think what we see is where that historical class-based representation on the left has weakened. It has opened the door for some of the far-right populism political parties that have emerged in parts of Europe and elsewhere in the world that are very clearly trying to appeal to the working class, not only on cultural and nationalistic identities in those kinds of terms, but also trying to appeal in terms of their material interests as well, using what is often known as welfare chauvinism, defending the welfare state for the true or authentic people, but trying to exclude immigrant populations and refugees, et cetera. So you see the far-right political parties trying to politicize the economic insecurities and politicizing citizenship rights. And there's, I think, new work that is being done that shows how labor unions, strong unions, are often a counterweight to those kinds of pressures. And so again, I think you see the far-right political parties that are often challenging democracy, trying to fill that political void where you see the weakening of class-based forms of representation on the left. And to the extent that you still see strong labor movements, they often provide an antidote to those kinds of anti-democratic politics. So those are just the three key dimensions that I talk about in the paper. As I said, constructing democratic regimes, deepening democracy, and then defending political democracy in contexts where we see growing challenges to it in recent times. So I will stop there and I'll let us move on to our next speaker.
Thanks, Ken. Chanda, we'll go with you next.
Thank you very much. Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, cool. Good morning, everyone. It's actually evening here where I am. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Chanda Chungu from the from the University of Zambia. It's a privilege to be part of this particular discourse, and I enjoyed the first presentation. The angle that we are taking with our particular presentation relates to the African perspective of labor rights as enhancers of democratic governance. And as part of our presentation, some of the issues that have been highlighted thus far come to the fore. And it becomes very important to understand that given the role that labor rights has in enhancing democratic governance, we have to go from the perspective of understanding what the history is in Africa with respect to these particular labor rights. As can be seen, there's very important evidence from the past that trade unions were the very early demonstrators in Africa in breaking down autocratic governments and fighting against colonialism. Evidence from this can be seen across the continent. And a lot of this manifested in protests where there was a call for change in this particular, in particular countries across the continent. As a result of this, you saw a lot of labor movements and these unions and these organizations becoming allies with those tasked with fighting for democracy. So for example, if you look at the union in South Africa, the union and the African National Congress are still in a coalition to this day, stemming from that history that we have where labor movements can be seen as internal constituents. In other countries, they were simply external allies of those fighting for democracy. So as a result of that particular history, we move to show that those who were tasked with safeguarding the interests of workers, it was seen as an early condition for pursuing the objective of independence and political freedom. And in most countries, it proved to be a success when these people and these movements were brought on to fight for this political freedom. And this, we believe, was a necessary condition that was guaranteed through the formation of particular democratic institutions where protecting and safeguarding workers' interests became important. In our paper, we contrast this to the formation of the ILO, which, as you know, when it was formed in 1919, as part of the organizations under the Treaty of Versailles, the critical interest there of the formation of the ILO was the safeguarding of workers' interests to avoid the proliferation of further unrest that could have stemmed from the particular unrest amongst workers. So that shows that the fighting for these labor rights becomes an important role in breaking down the autocracy that we have of the past. Now, what necessitated the strength of the labor movements to become what they were pre-independent or in the authoritarian regimes was the economic and social conditions. Now, the economic and social conditions were a product of the history of Africa and the conquest. It's because of that history and the treatment of primarily Black workers in Africa that you saw that these movements became stronger and stronger. And as a result of that strength, were able to form what we call the allies or the friends of those fighting for democratic freedom. This is because the movements that represented the working class played a critical role, as you can say, as the mouthpiece of the working populations, okay? Because of this. Now, post-independence, you saw that for a short time period, labor movements continued to play a role in deepening democracy on the strength of the conditions that persisted post getting freedom from the colonizers. Now, what happened is the challenges that were faced, as you can see in various countries, has been the weakening of the labor movements, which in our view has failed to properly allow these trade unions to continue to entrench democracy and the movements to become a mouthpiece of democracy. It's the weakening of these movements. And what has caused the weakening of these movements? In particular countries, you can say it's number one, the lower unionized rate. Because of the extenuation of independence, you find that the right for people to join or not to join a union becomes more pertinent. And as a result, where there's less take-up by unions across the continent, the unions are less of a mouthpiece enabled to entrench democracy in their particular regions. A second issue is where there was either centralization or decentralization of a movement. The centralization or decentralization of a movement, as the case may be, had the effect of dividing the movement from what it was into various multiple other unions where there's less of a voice amongst them. And that, coupled with the low unionization, we believe has caused the movement to be less of a mouthpiece and more fragmented in its nature, having less of a power. Then a third challenge is how the movement is treated by the state. So you find in a lot of legislation across the continent, and something that is expressly not strictly permitted by the ILO, is where governments have more of a say in how the unions are managed. This has proven to be a challenge. So, for example, in some countries, the state can block a strike from happening if it's in the public interest. In several legislation across the continent, what is defined as the public interest is not even defined. There's also provisions that allow the states to exclude certain groups of employees from being members of the union, extending it beyond those who are in essential services, further weakening the ability of the unions to speak on behalf of a wider group of workers. These challenges have meant that over the last 3 decades, the particular labor movements and the power that they had has formed a position where labor rights continue to be important, but the ability of the movements to fight on behalf of the workers in decreasing this unrest has been weakened through the 3 points that I've just mentioned. Now, when we are looking at this, we also have to say, okay, what is the concept of civil society, and how does this link to what I've mentioned about labor movements, particularly in the context of the acceptance of the procedures that allow competition and the alternation of government. The idea of the rise of civil society in Africa is supposed to have complemented this decisive move in terms of the changes of the labor movement from what they were pre-independent to what they are today. Now, the challenge again with civil society is the characterization of the deep inequalities that continue to be existent and the influence and access to power, the same issues we mentioned with respect to labor movements. These particular challenges, again, are what we say fragment the ability of people to represent these collective labor rights issues and allow it for them to continue to form allies with the government as a way of ensuring that democracy continues to be entrenched. Now, further to this, we can also say that the rise in informal modes of mobilization as well have greatly taken their toll, and we are of the view that there has to be a move where towards the working together of the various strands to ensure that the role of the labor movements, although it has changed, can still be relevant today, notwithstanding the challenges that have been faced by its transformation. Lastly, or well, not quite lastly, but one of the points that we have to also make is in deepening democracy, there's a need to also recognize that the informal economy, which forms a majority of the workers in Africa, needs to be also very addressed. The informal economy refers to the group of workers who are not, in atypical forms of employment, employment that's not strictly by way of contract of employment, for example. And in Africa, they form about 70 to 80% of the working population. Their lack of representation is what has also caused this this fragmentation of the movement, and bringing them in on board, coupled with the coordination with all movements tasked with protecting labor rights, becomes very important to ensure the galvanization of as many workers as possible in playing a role in deepening and entrenching democracy across the continent. We are of the belief that without this bringing together of the movements that are tasked with fighting for labor rights, democracy in Africa will not be entrenched, and without it being entrenched, it will be difficult for the democracy to be deepened from the angle that was seen in the pre-independence times. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chanda. That was a very interesting presentation. We'll move now to Wilma Liebman. We are missing one of our speakers. We shifted the time of our talk, and I hope that that hasn't disrupted Nelson Lichtenstein's participation, but he may yet join us. So I will note, Mark, since you contributed a chapter, if you have any comments at the end, you're welcome to make them. But let's go to Wilma now, and it's fine if we also have a lengthier question and comment period. Wilma.
Yes, thank you, Angela. It's my pleasure to be here today with you and the co-panelists. I might mention that I think about a week or so ago, I saw Kenneth Roberts' name on a list of about 100 democracy scholars who wrote a letter decrying the decline of democracy and the fears about that. So my contribution to this volume really began a little bit earlier, in early 2019, when I was asked to contribute to a conference in Paris at the Collège de France on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the ILO. Chanda's already mentioned that. And historian Tony Judt, about 20 years ago, wrote that Paris in the spring of 1919 is still the best starting place for anyone wanting to understand today's world. And I think that is, of course, in many respects true. That was the end of the First World War. And in May 1919, in the aftermath of the Great War and during the Versailles peace negotiations, United States President Woodrow Wilson cabled Congress from Paris. He said, "The question which stands at the front of all others amidst the present great awakening is the question of labor. How are the men and women who do the daily labor of the world to obtain progressive improvement in the conditions of their labor? The object of all reform in this essential matter must be the genuine democratization of industry." And so for this Cambridge volume, I addressed this question of labor and the answer, the democratization of industry. I addressed it in three subparts, which are chronological. I'm going to spend the most time on the first, but let me outline all three. So the first section of the chapter scans the historical context of the labor question that President Wilson mentioned, and the radically diverse interpretations and experimentation with industrial democracy, which throughout US labor history has been widely regarded as the answer to the labor question. But what the term industrial democracy means has been subject to radically diverse interpretations. It covers a broad spectrum of meanings. From the post-Civil War to the New Deal, the notion of industrial democracy has included worker ownership plans, visionary ideas of a cooperative commonwealth, collective bargaining, and employer-sponsored welfare capitalism. So I'm going to come back and spend the most time on the intellectual and activist ferment of a century ago that led to all of those different ideas. The second part of the chapter outlines what is probably more familiar to most of the audience, which is that industrial democracy ultimately came to have meaning in this country through collective bargaining, which was sponsored by the AFL unions and the CIO unions. And it came with the enactment of the Depression era, 1935 National Labor Relations Act, known as the Wagner Act. And the chapter scans how optimism about the law's promise and achievements eventually turned into disenchantment. So at the time, the Wagner Act was considered to be one of the most drastic legislative innovations of the decade. Industrial democracy was now presented not only as a moral exigency, but also as a foundation for the success of a complex industrial economy. Its notion of equalizing bargaining power was seen as a way of ultimately restoring the nation from the throes of the Depression. And as historian Dorothy Sue Cobble has written, the Wagner Act also marked an intellectual revolution in both economic and legal theory. And she writes that one of its most important yet oft forgotten legacies was its challenge to the reigning theories of laissez-faire and liberty of contract, upon which Gilded Age wealth and power resided. So the Wagner Act advanced the idea that actual liberty of contract could occur only when the parties had relative equality of bargaining power. And for several decades, it seemed to work. It brought millions of people into the middle class. But we're all familiar with the historical arc of the decline of this law, beginning in 1947 with the Taft-Hartley amendments at the conclusion of the Second World War, which were all very anti-union, anti-worker. There have been no significant amendments to this law since 1947, notwithstanding several reform efforts, which all ended in legislative gridlock. We're all familiar with the fact that it is today out of sync with a very transformed economy, with hostile court review of decisions of the National Labor Relations Board. I should probably mention that for nearly 14 years, I sat as a member of the National Labor Relations Board, and for about 2 years as its chairman during the early Obama administration. I saw hostile court review. I'm well aware with the board's infamous flip-flopping on doctrine every time the White House changes, deep divisions about the law within the board itself, among its board members, and within society generally. This is a law that really has never been fully accepted as legitimate. And since the 1980s, labor law scholars have described the US labor law regime, one vision of industrial democracy only, as America's unfulfilled promise, as an elegant tombstone for a dying institution, and as an anachronism irrelevant for most workers and firms. So that was labor law scholarship in the 1980s. I would say things since then have only gone downhill. And while scholars and advocates agree that the law is outdated, beyond that, there is absolutely no consensus for reform. So that's the second part of this chapter. The third part of the chapter sketches the glimmerings of industrial democracy's revival as the labor question has reemerged in our society. At this uncertain historical moment, the post-war social contract has unraveled, wages have stagnated, inequality has skyrocketed, union density in the private sector workforce has plunged, workers' bargaining power has eroded, and corporate influence has gone largely unchecked. Democratic institutions are under stress, and a specter of illiberalism haunts America and threatens our political democracy, exacerbated now by, as Kenneth discussed, authoritarian populism, and pandemic-induced economic depression. In this context, however, there are echoes today of the intellectual and activist ferment of a century ago. Older pre-Wagner Act ideas about industrial democracy are being reimagined, new strategies are explored, there's much creative experimentation underway with new forms of worker voice and power, not limited to traditional collective bargaining structures, and collective action by workers is on the rise. We are, I believe, witnessing a potentially transformative dynamism of both thought and action not seen in decades. In this wholly unprecedented context of the interlocking crises of the last year, the trauma and shocks of the last 4 years, and particularly the last 6 months, all of the current agitation may just provide a laboratory for testing a new social compact and foretell another great imagining of industrial democracy. My hope is that that will embrace a multifaceted visionary approach to the labor question, one which befits a large, complex political economy in a moment of stunning upheaval, the likes of which we have not seen since the 1930s. And so I think, Angela, do I have a few more minutes?
You do.
Okay, so having said that, I want to return to part one, because I think maybe that's less familiar to the audience, and maybe provide some seeds for current reimagining. So I quoted what Woodrow Wilson said in 1919. His support for the democratization of industry has been described as largely rhetorical, but still at that time in 1919, there was widespread acknowledgement that the labor question was not merely the supreme economic question, but also the constitutive, moral, political, and social dilemma of the new industrial order. Historian Richard White has described the core of the labor question as how to reconcile the democratic promise of the nation with the profoundly undemocratic organization of industry. So, as I mentioned, throughout US history, industrial democracy has been widely regarded as the answer to the labor question, but that has been subject to radically diverse interpretation. The rapid industrialization and technological innovation of the late 19th century were accompanied by periodic depression, consolidation of industries into powerful monopolies, extreme inequality, political agitation, and massive labor strife, often bloody. Much of that sounds pretty familiar today. These conditions at the late 19th century propelled the growth of various social movements and national labor organizations. Labor Republicans argued that the Constitution itself embodied the right of workers to shape the conditions of their own work and to negotiate equitable returns on their labor. Some unions championed worker ownership of factories. The Knights of Labor embraced the goal of establishing a system of cooperative production to overthrow the wage labor system and private capitalism. And through the social gospel movement, Christian churches also played a role in bringing worker ownership into the national dialogue. But eventually most worker-owned companies failed and interest in worker ownership waned. Many unions then focused on gains through collective bargaining within the existing private enterprise and wage earner system. The AFL saw producers' cooperatives as unrealistic, and they insisted that workers have equal bargaining power with employers, defending the right to strike and opposing reliance on government in place of collective bargaining. AFL President Samuel Gompers declared that there never existed, coincident with each other, autocracy in the shop and democracy in political life. These abuses of industrial capitalism gave rise to the progressive movement of the early 20th century. Louis Brandeis, for example, argued for democracy in industry as a corollary to political democracy. And he warned that while technological invention created possibilities of releasing men and women from drudgery, the factory system and the business corporation created new dangers to liberty. In the first 15 years of the 20th century, many labor reformers focused on raising wages limiting the workday and restricting employers' control, while more radical groups sought more expansive transformation. Employers, for their part, sought to preempt the growth of radical challenges to capitalism as they saw erupting in Europe. They were hostile to the notion of industry as an arena for the democratic process. Many resorted to outright repressive tactics. Still, some employers did support collective bargaining, and some experimented with non-union forms of employee representation. But it was economic mobilization for the First World War that ignited explosive union activity, and an array of new government agencies were created to try to control the conflict so the war effort wouldn't be interrupted. Many employers, either on their own or pressured by government agencies, set up shop committees elected by workers, supervised by the government, to resolve disputes. These were billed as a non-union form of industrial democracy, and they allowed for meetings between workers and management. So the intervention by the government during the First World War, the use of these quasi-representative shop committees altered workers' expectations about the possibilities for democracy. Unions hoped that these shop committees would become union organizations when the war actually ended. But unions and progressives misjudged the reactionary forces that were unleashed by the war. So the federal government agencies retrenched, and any possibility that industrial democracy might be defined in the political arena was destroyed. Employer repression followed, and by 1920, despair reigned among those who recently had felt that the democratization of industry was imminent. During the 1920s, employers were eager again to forestall the emergence of independent trade unions, and enlightened employers employed their own strategy of welfare capitalism. Hundreds of non-union companies constructed recreational facilities, made safety and sanitation improvements, supplemented wages with profit sharing, installed seniority systems, and launched shop committees, works councils, and employee representation plans, which unions attacked as phony company unions. And by the way, as everyone knows, the Wagner Act outlawed these forms of company unions. So while the aim of welfare capitalism was to avoid both unions and government reform, it did, in some cases, whet workers' appetite for even greater voice and participation, including genuine unionization. And that some, like Sanford Jacoby, has said that this unique American non-union form of industrial democracy might very well have persisted as the chief current of industrial relations, if not for the economic crisis of the 1930s, which made it financially impossible for employers to sustain the cost of welfare capitalism. So you know the rest of the story from the 1930s on. I've briefly outlined that. Let me conclude by saying what I conclude the paper with, and it became clear to me in reviewing this history. Henry Adams wrote in 1880 that democracy was at its heart a clash of interests. And the history reveals that democracy in both the workplace and in the broader society has been an experiment in America from its birth, in a repeated cycle of promise, disappointment, and renewal. Renewal that often comes in times of crises when the fault lines in society are laid bare. So let's hope that's one of these moments.
Thank you so much, Wilma, and thank you for ending on that more upbeat note. So we have a few minutes now to hear from the audience. We've got a nice group here, so it would be wonderful to hear your comments or questions. Maybe not to put Mark on the spot, but if you wanted to start us off with a comment or question, I'm happy to give you the floor.
Great, thanks, Angela, and thanks for the wonderful presentation. So I'm looking at Ken, and Ken, on my other screen, I'm following the election results coming in from, which country, Peru. So talk about political polarization. One thing, so I did the chapter on Latin America, and the one thing that strikes me there when we look at this question is, who are the workers and where are they in the economy and the differences there? So you start off by seeing a very large number in the informal sector, and still some countries, a significant number in agriculture. And so, I try to unpack this question: democracy, labor, and equality. I emphasize the role of the state, really, very, very significant. I see Nelson on too. Maybe I should, once I see Nelson, I want to be quiet and listen. But anyway, so the role of the state is very crucial in Latin America. And the argument I make, and it's done, Colin Carter made this years ago, is that if you're very weak at the workplace level, you have enterprise unionism, you target the state for improvements, for welfare, for wages, and so on. So the state has been very, very crucial. So I was going to, with that, turn it over to Ken and say, maybe through the prism of Peru, because I know you're a Peru expert, what would you say as far as what your framework was that you laid out? What does the Peru, experiment tell us? And I'm thinking like the rural vote is coming in, and like agricultural sector and so on, and this political polarization. So what do you think about sort of this, who are the workers in whether it's Africa as well? I see a lot of similarities with Latin America. I think in general, post-colonization in Africa, unions tended to be a bit more unified than in Latin America. They're much more fragmented with a few exceptions. But I don't know if that makes sense, Ken, but if that's sort of, it's been on my mind a lot, and I think there's some lessons there.
Thanks, Mark. Ken, hold your thought, because we do have Nelson. So I know it'll be a little bit, we'll have to postpone Ken's response just for a bit, because we'll give Nelson the floor to try to squeeze in his talk. Thanks so much for joining us. Sorry if the reshifting of the panel time was disruptive, but the floor is yours, Nelson. Thanks very much for joining. Oh, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
I apologize if I came in late. I thought this was I don't know. I thought I was in the right time, but anyway, maybe I did something wrong.
No worries, no worries.
Okay. Well, I want to talk a little bit about sectorial bargaining, and actually, there's a current controversy taking place about it in New York. I'll mention that as well. But I do think someone just mentioned the future of enterprise-based unionism in the U.S. looks bleak. By the way, how much time should I take here? What's my time frame?
You have about 8 minutes.
Okay, it looks bleak, because as we saw in Bessemer, there's just a lot in both law and practice that is weighing against it, and I think that, and also, of course, the protecting the right to organize law looks its future is not assured at all. In this context, of course, that sectorial bargaining has come to the fore, certainly among labor partisans, but also, as we'll see, among the corporations, and in this current New York State contretemps, Uber and DoorDash are attempting to use it for their own purposes. I think sectorial, I want to emphasize the progressive era roots of sectorial bargaining. Kate Andrus has argued that there's elements of it are possible out of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, and that's true. But the current revival of sectorial bargaining in various states is really, I think, predicated and in some ways directly linked to the progressive era experiments. The wage boards, industrial commissions set up 100 years ago are often still in existence, and they can be revived and used, and they are. Someone trying to, and they often are. In fact, in California, there's an effort a bill has been introduced to create a fast food industry council that would do the same sort of things. Back in the the day 100 years ago, for example, in Massachusetts, where there was a wage board, it covered workers in candy, laundry, retail stores, women's clothing, men's clothing, canning, and office cleaning industries. These were industries where women worked primarily, immigrants, and often children, people with less less rights in the world of industry than than male workers. Although even then, of course, the male workers didn't have a Wagner era rights. Just a moment. In Washington D.C., a wage board led by Clara Beyer and Elizabeth Brandeis, pioneering of feminist reformers, often called by one historian conviction bureaucrats, showed the possibilities of these sectorial bargaining wage boards as mobilizing institutions as well as regulatory institutions. And Clara Beyer would visit stores and laundries and give speeches for employers and employees, and basically urge them to come and use the facility. And then just 100 years later, there was an account in the New York Times to raise the fast food wages in New York State, and it sounded just like 1919. That is, you had here's the Times. It says organizers turned out a large and vocal crowd that included pizza makers, cashiers, unionized graduate students, economists, rabbis. At this hearing, so they aren't just technocratic. These hearings are not just technocratic or bureaucratic. Again, Andrus, I'm not going to get into what her argument is. There was in the Fair Labor Standards Act of '38 a provisions for tripartite bargaining on a sectoral basis. It was there for about a decade, but it went into eclipse. Mainly because the big industrial unions of the post-war period seemed to have the ticket, the idea, we're going to have pattern bargaining. And the pattern bargaining in auto and steel, etc., really was a form of sectorial bargaining. Of course, it was done without use of the state. And of course, in the McCarthy era and the more conservative period, the unions feared the state. Walter Reuther once said, I'd rather bargain with General Motors than the United States. GM has no army, and so that sense of even the more social democratic wing of the labor movement wanted this privatized view. But of course, in industries which are more fragmented, which really resemble those today, of course, garments is still that case, but there's so many others, and especially in the world of fissured employment, the idea of sectorial bargaining then, in the New Deal era and today, has the same appeal. Sidney Hillman, head of the garment workers, made the point, and of course he was trying to organize apparel shops all over the country, that if you unionize just a section of the industry, you're really basically voting yourselves out of a job, because the high wage unionized shops will eventually either go bankrupt or leave. And so therefore Hillman was always an advocate of state action, and in World War II he actually sort of achieved a kind of sectorial bargaining in many of these fragmented industries, baking and apparel and et cetera, textiles. And so that's really, coming back today. I want to mention one thing here. I'm sure that the legal people on the panel can talk more about it, but the thing about sectorial bargaining is that because it's although it can have de facto bargaining, in law, it's a state action by a commission on the state level, and therefore the preemption doctrine, which prevents so many states from trying to modify the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, does not apply to minimum wage laws that states can pass. And so the reason we have all these different minimum wage laws in the country is because they are just state activities done by the state. They aren't part of collective bargaining, part of the NLRA. And so sectorial bargaining, even when it resembles bargaining, can slips in under the rubric of this state action, and therefore it's not preempted. And that is pretty important today. Let me just say, In California, I'm almost finished. The liberals in the legislature have introduced a bill to establish a statewide fast foods sector council, which would bring together representatives of workers, employers, and public sector regulators to make recommendations regarding minimum wage, compensation, safety, scheduling, etc. This sectorial bargaining legislation is careful to maintain the employment status of fast food workers. They remain employees while ending the fissuring of workplace responsibility that McDonald's, Burger King, and other large corporations have foisted upon franchisees. Thus, if local fast food franchises violate the law, so too does the corporate overlord. Let's see, so I think so that's and of course the COVID experience and the health issues have put some steam behind that law and the effort to get it. But I have to end this talk on a note of caution. In New York, another sectorial bargaining bill stands before the state legislature. But this one might well have been written by Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash. Unfortunately, it has also been pushed forward by some unions because in return for the maintenance of the independent contractor fiction for hundreds of thousands of gig workers, this New York gambit would facilitate the formation of what in effect are company-funded unions covering drivers or delivery workers. Money and membership is at stake, upwards of 30 million a year for a company union enrolling perhaps 100,000 drivers in New York. But the proposed law has been roundly condemned by other unions, including the Militant Taxi Driver Alliance in New York, as well as those academics fearful that Uber and Lyft will attempt to legitimize their business model by cloaking employment relations as a species of sectorial bargaining in sheep's clothing. This effort by the companies is not dissimilar from the early 30s, when big corporations like US Steel and Chrysler sought to counter the rise of industrial unionism with a set of company unions. Today, the very fact that sectorial bargaining holds such promise has generated a similar response from those 21st century employers at the commanding heights of our economy. So that's the analogy. Company unionism was stopped in the early 30s. I think that this ersatz sectorial bargaining can be stopped and will be stopped today. Thank you. I can't hear you. Let's see. I can't hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks, sorry. Thank you so much, Nelson. Yes, the sectoral bargaining is such a critical topic, and it's a very good chapter, and it really is the only way forward, it seems, for us. We have a couple of minutes. If anyone has a comment or a question for the panelists, I'm happy to give you the floor. Any comments or questions?
And there was a question from Dina Bishara in the chat. Maybe
Okay. Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Oh, thanks so much. Chanda, did you see Dina Bishara's question? I wondered if you could say a bit about how unions in Africa are addressing informal labor and the integration of informal workers in unions. Great question, Dina. Chanda, do you want to respond to Dina's question?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much for the question. Sorry, it's dark here, so you won't be able to see me. Yes, so very important question. And I think the ways of tackling it is to say that the strategy of the unions in Africa has been threefold. The first ambit that you can say that the unions have been pushing is for the change in the definition of who is an employee in terms of employment and industrial relations legislation. This is very important because the definition of who an employee was largely dependent on that person having a written contract with their employer. Now there's been a change to recognize that most informal employees are not engaged in that way, and transformational changes legislation is required so that those employees are recognized as employees in terms of the law. Secondly, there's been a move towards trying to organize the informal economy across the continent. Now, this is very tricky because, as you know, the informal economy is largely unorganized. It's largely unorganized, and as a result of being largely unorganized, it's very difficult to identify the sectors to which the employees belong. So some unions have been trying to find ways of organizing these employees into various sectors and moving them towards the more appropriate union that would defend the interests, or in the case of Zambia, for example, having a union specifically for the informal economy workers on their own. And then thirdly, it's the importance of awareness. Having done the groundwork of saying, okay, we want to have informal economy workers as part of our, as part of the framework, as part of being representative. The main issue now is to have them have the knowledge of the existence of these movements and unions to allow them to become part of the same. Because the main issue, again, with the informal economy is the lack of awareness and, of course, the lack of the contributory capacity to contribute, for example, to the membership fees of the union, or knowing of the benefits of being part of a union. So these three things are what unions have been using as their strategies to inculcate the need for informal economy workers to be part of their movements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chanda. I think we're out of time, but I'm willing to take one more comment or question if anyone would, if anyone has a pressing comment or question on the topic of labor and democracy for our speakers. I'm happy to squeeze one in.
And maybe just someone else jump in. I was going to say if Ken wanted to say a few words about.
Yes, I was going to say, if not, then Ken, did you want to respond to Mark's question?
I couldn't resist, Ken. Sorry.
I mean, we're all keeping a close eye on this razor-thin election that just took place in Peru, that, you know, highly polarized, as you indicated, between a right-wing candidate and a left-wing candidate who comes out of the labor movement, actually. But I think in some ways your question puts, you know, it connects back to what Chanda was just talking about, and Adina Bishara's question about, you know, the reality of these large informal sector economies and, you know, countries where, I mean, in Chanda's paper, he talks about how, you know, up to 90% of the workforce in many African countries is de facto in the informal sector. And as you know, Mark, in parts of Latin America, you have 50, 60, 70% of the population or of the workforce that is in the informal sector. And we should point out, you know, part of what Nelson is just talking about in, you know, with the gig economy workers is de facto an informalization, a part of the workforce in the United States, and the emergence of workers like we see in Latin America in the informal sector. They're kind of workers, but they're kind of petty entrepreneurs, and they're in these intermediate categories, and the economic interests are highly diverse, and it's difficult to unionize everywhere. We do see, you know, there are some places where you see some kinds of organization of informal sector workers and some efforts of labor unions to build bridges, but it's a challenge just simply because of it's just the reality of social heterogeneity of modern capitalism, and of course with the law, you know, and the political dynamics reinforce that. So in some ways, the kinds of struggles that Nelson is talking about in the United States are similar to what we've seen in Latin America and Africa, where you have these large informal sectors of the workforce who typically are not well connected to traditional kinds of labor unions and the way in which they represent workers' interests. And so it's an ongoing challenge for Latin America, for labor in Latin America. And indeed, you know, anytime we talk about the Latin Americanization of other places, it usually tends to be a signal that there are trend lines that you should worry about. And in this case, informalization becoming a dominant mode of organizing capitalism in much of the world, I think is problematic.
Yeah, I remember from work in Paraguay, I think the rate of informality is like 80%. It's really tremendous. So I think we probably have to leave there. Our panel is over, but I want to thank you so much for your wonderful contributions. The volume comes out in January, and I hope you're interested in enough to pick it up. And I wish we had more time, but we'll have to wait for another occasion. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us, and very much for our excellent panelists. Take good care.
Thanks, Angela. Bye.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Still there? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, this is the problem being the West Coast. You sometimes screw up the time.
No, that's okay.
Sorry.
You know,
Just
it
give
worked
me,
out.
When you're on the
me a
panel,
quick-
you're doing.
Nelson, thank you for your note. I have to run.